Hello, boys and girls. It's time for another reading from the Jesus Storybook Bible. Tonight, our stories are about God's people, Israel in the wilderness, and Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. So there they all were, grannies, granddads, babies, uncles, aunts, children, moms and dads, out there in the middle of the desert. They had blisters from all the walking. They were hungry and thirsty, and much, much too hot. "We don't like it," they said. "It stinks." And so did they, for that matter, because no one had taken a bath in weeks. Now remember, because this is something they'd forgotten, God had done amazing things for his people. He'd hidden them inside a cloud. He'd moved the sea. He'd set them free. But God's people still weren't happy. They didn't care about being free. Wasn't it better when they were slaves? At least they'd had lots of nice food to eat. "No, God doesn't want us to be happy," they said. It was the same lie that Adam and Eve had heard all those years before. "God's brought us out here to kill us. God doesn't love us." But they didn't know God very well, did they? Every day of their journey, God kept on showing his people how well he would look after them, if they would trust him and obey him. When they were hungry, God made the sky rain with food, bread coming down from heaven. "What is it?" they asked each other. They didn't know, so they called it, "What is it?" which, of course, is a very good name for something when you don't know what it is. When they were thirsty and started quarreling, God made water flow from a rock. Moses called the place Quarreling, because that seemed like a good name too. And still, God's children didn't trust him or do what he said. They thought they could do a better job of looking after themselves and making themselves happy. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without him. So God led them to a tall mountain. God wanted to talk to his people and show them what he was like. He wanted to help them know him better and tell them about the special land he was going to give them. "The whole earth belongs to me," God said, "but I've chosen you. You're my special family. I want you to live in a way that shows everyone else what I'm like, so they can know me too." So God called Moses up on the mountain. The great mountain shook. A thick cloud fell. Thunder roared. Lightning cracked. And God gave Moses 10 rules, called commandments. "I want you to love me more than anything else in all the world, and to know that I love you too," God told them. "That is the most important thing of all." God gave them other rules, like don't make yourselves pretend gods, don't kill people or steal or lie. The rules showed God's people how to live, and how to be close to him, and how to be happy. They showed how life worked best. "God promises to always look after you," Moses said. "Will you love him and keep these rules?" "We can do it. Yes, we promise." But they were wrong. They couldn't do it. No matter how hard they tried, they could never keep God's rules all the time. And God knew they couldn't, and he wanted them to know it too. Only one person could keep all the rules, and many years later God would send him to stand in their place and be perfect for them, because the rules couldn't save them. Only God could save them. Well, after Moses died, God gave his people a new leader, and his name was Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into the special land God had promised to give them. By this time, God's people had been wandering around in the baking desert for 40 years. So you can imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow and tents and walking and being hot, and how happy they were to reach the edge of the desert and see their beautiful new home right there in front of them, all cool and green and lovely. There was only one problem: Jericho. Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress, and it stopped anybody from getting into the land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls all around it, at the tall, towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut. They looked at each other. What would they do? No one knew, but God knew. And God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked surprised, because it was a very odd battle plan indeed, as we'll soon find out. Then God made his people a promise. "I will always be with you. I will never, ever leave you. And if you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy and everything will go well." So Joshua gathered his army together. They had their swords and their spears and shields. They were ready to fight. But the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching around the city, day after day. "They're too scared to fight," the people in Jericho said. But they were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city not once, but 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Has anyone ever told you to make as much noise as you possibly can? Well, imagine that noise, and add 39,999 other people making that noise too, and you get the idea. Ear-splitting. And, as it turned out, stone-splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground, as if they were made of sand. Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. So it was that God's people entered their new home, and they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua said, "God has brought you safely here. Now will you do what he says?" Everyone said, "We promise." "Only God can make your hearts happy," Joshua said. "So don't pray to pretend gods." "No," they said, "never." I'm afraid they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God warned them, things would go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves, and God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home no one could ever take from them.